Hey, everybody out there in the true rest world, Dr. Michael Breus, the sleep doctor here. I am extremely excited to be talking to you today about the benefits of floating for sleep. What are you talking about, floating for sleep? How do you float for sleep? There's a lot of really interesting science out there. We're going to have a big discussion about it today and talk about it. So when we look at floating, here's what we would say is floating is the perfect accessory to sleep. So let's dive right in. The top question that I get asked usually is, okay, Michael, how can float therapy assist in sleep in any way, shape, or form? So first of all, we've got some great information on the website for people. If you're interested and you're more of a reader than a watcher, there's some good stuff over there. But let's break it down really quickly. So number one, if any of you have never floated before, then you might not understand, but it's like, honestly, it's like a side effect of floating is great sleep. But here's what ends up happening is the number one factor that deters people from sleep is anxiety. Just bottom line, okay? I've been treating people for 23 years. My specialty is insomnia. That's the bottom line, is it's anxiety. Here's what basically happens. A massive amount of relaxation occurs once you deprive your human body from all the sensory input. And I think that's number one thing that happens is people walk out with a positive experience, but more importantly, anxiety reduction that has a tendency to last actually throughout the night and throughout multiple nights. So that in and of itself was step one into determining how does floating actually affect sleep. Lowering anxiety, what does that do? Helps people fall asleep more quickly, and it also helps people get into deeper stages of sleep. The second thing that I thought about was, well, what about my environment? Like specifically the water, like what's in the water, right? Well, there's a lot of salt, but there's also magnesium. We know that magnesium has tremendous good effects for the body for sleep. So you're floating in a pool of sea salt and magnesium, which is really good for your sleep. So once again, we're seeing another aspect that's really important. The third one, I would argue, is the deprivation itself, right? So we're not having inputting data. We're not having, somebody, knocking on the pod, hey mom, where's my grilled cheese type of thing, that's not the constant barrage of things that's going on. And so lowering the stimulus that's coming in is certainly going to have an effect on across the board on all of the functions going well. There's also some science to discuss the idea of a circadian rhythm being influenced by that level of deprivation. And so I've had some people tell me they go into a float tank and it helps them with their jet lag because it helps recenter them from a circadian perspective. So, I mean, that's 4 different areas that I can tell you straight out of the gates that floating is going to have an effect, a positive effect on sleep. But let's talk about what happens in your brain when you're floating. Here's what's pretty fascinating is if you look at the data on floating, it actually lowers cortisol, right? You can't have high cortisol before bed and be able to fall asleep, right? It doesn't make sense because you're fighting and flighting, right? But what floating does on the brain chemistry level is it lowers that cortisol. What we're discovering in insomnia and in many people who have difficulty sleeping is that their cortisol levels are kind of wonky and in some cases elevated at night. Well, if we know that floating helps reduce cortisol and we know that there are people out there who have high cortisol at night and it affects their sleep, hello, we stick them all together and what we see is the cortisol lowers and they have a much better option for sleeping. There's also a second thing that's happening that's kind of interesting as well, and that has to do with something called serotonin. So serotonin actually gets activated as you become relaxed. It's called the comfort hormone because it makes you feel comfortable, right? Many people don't know, but serotonin is a precursor to melatonin. Okay. Remember, melatonin is that key that, starts the engine for sleep. So we want to have melatonin. So by floating, you actually increase the serotonin in your brain, which helps with the production of melatonin. So not only are we reducing cortisol, but we're increasing serotonin, which again, very positive that we're lowering cortisol as well. You look at your body when you're sleeping versus floating, very different scenarios. So when you're floating, the aspect of support takes on an entirely new meaning, right? So historically, when you look at a mattress, it's a firm foundational flat support. It's not particularly dynamic. It kind of just sticks there. When you're in a float pod, it's a completely different situation. So it would make intuitive sense that it would have a completely separate effect on the body. In fact, when you're lying in a bed, you're getting pressure pushed up against you, right? People get pressure points. Like if you sleep on your side, remember all of your weight is leaning on your side. And so you get this capillary crush on here. You maybe get a little bit of muscle damage, a little bit of tingly. That doesn't happen when you float, right? Because there's not pressure on you to do that. So floating actually allows your body to have a true total relaxation in a way, shape, and form that, quite frankly, sleep can't give you unless you fall asleep in the sleep pod. Here's what's awesome is when you put yourself into a float environment, your entire system starts to slow down, which is good, which means that your blood pressure doesn't have to pump as hard and as fast, so it begins to slow down. Also, to be fair, you're lying down, right? When you're lying down, your body doesn't have to fight gravity to push blood up and down. So again, blood pressure begins to lower. So lying in a recumbent position in and of itself is a great idea. But then if you do that without any of the pressure around you, and then when you give yourself some nice music to listen to, maybe some nice lights, all of a sudden, everything starts to get more relaxed. And that's when your blood pressure goes down. Now, you might not have heard of the term chronotype, but you've definitely heard of the concept if you've ever been called an early bird or a night owl. Those are chronotypes. So guess what? Chronotypes are your genetic disposition for when to sleep and when to wake up, okay? And so somebody who's an early bird, guess what? Their melatonin turns off at 5 a.m. and that's one of the reasons why they wake up. But guess what? It turns on at like 8 o'clock at night, which is one of the reasons why they go to bed so early. So the same holds true for humans throughout the span, not just looking at sleep, but also looking at the best time to float. So if you start to think about it, if you're an early bird, you probably don't want to schedule a float for 10 o'clock at night, right? It wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't be congruent with who you are and how your schedule works. So start to think about times in your day where you could use a relief, right? A lowering of your stress, right? Everybody has those times throughout their day. Those are perfect times to consider a float. Or maybe 90 minutes before bed. There's data out there to show now that if people take a hot bath 90 minutes before bed and raise their core body temperature, the subsequent drop of the core body temperature allows them to fall asleep. Now, to be fair, the pods aren't hot. That's not the goal for them. They're more body temperature, which is 98.6 degrees, so it's pretty close. So the thing to remember here is that it's the lowering of that level of anxiety. So allowing yourself to have some time before lights out is going to make a whole lot of sense. So again, about 90 minutes before you want to go to bed is probably the best time for you to float. So they actually call it rest, reduced environmental stimulus therapy. I mean, they call it rest, for God's sakes, right? I mean, how could it not have something to do with sleep?